hearings? Are you worried about what...
reveal, sir?
Everyone has heard of Ronald Reagan and his presidency in the 1980s, but not everyone knows of the Iran Contra Affair, an illegal aid operation between the US and the Contras, funded by an underground weapons deal with Iran, operating right under the watch of Reagan himself. So what really happened? What effects did it have on the US internal and diplomatic relations, and why did conventional diplomacy break down? But before we talk about the main operation, we must first understand Ronald Reagan's place at this time. Reagan was an incredibly popular president, frequently credited for bringing back American pride, and was already in his second term. This meant that he had a sort of freedom to take risks that would otherwise be very dangerous for his reputation. In addition, Reagan was a cold warrior, and showed that he was willing to uphold democracy using any means necessary, and was very anti-communist. This idea in particular would be hugely influential in causing the Iran Contra Affair. On the other side of the story were the Contras. The Contras were a group of militant Nicaraguans with the goal of overthrowing the communist Nicaraguan government. Reagan saw potential in them, even viewing them as moral equivalents of our founding fathers, not to mention the fact that they, like Reagan, were very anti-communist. This led Reagan to wish to aid their efforts in some way. However, not everyone was on the same page, and the matter became quite controversial, likely due to the fact that, in addition to being the moral equivalents of founding fathers, they also happened to be major cocaine suppliers. Though Reagan was able to look past their wrongdoings and stand by his opinions, many could not do the same. Hence, in the early 1980s, the Boland Amendment was passed, prohibiting the federal government from providing any aid for groups overthrowing the government of Nicaragua. The third part of this story takes place across the world in Iran, and deeply integrates into the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, a group of Iranian terrorists invaded the embassy and took almost 70 Americans hostage. A year later, as President Carter's term was coming to an end and Reagan was running for office, the hostages had still not yet been released. Reagan often criticized President Carter for not doing enough about the crisis, and claimed that he would do better if he were president. On the last day of Carter's presidency, and 444 days after the start of the crisis, the hostages were released. Although it was over, the relationship between the US and Iran remained hostile. As Reagan took office, he vowed to continue Carter's policy of blocking arms sales to Iran as long as they supported terrorism. But that was not the last of the hostage crises in Reagan's presidency. In 1982, members of the terrorist group Hezbollah, which had deep ties to Iran, captured 144 tourists, most of which were American. As Reagan often said when campaigning that he could do a better job with the first hostage crisis, he felt a lot of pressure to free the hostages in Lebanon as fast as possible. Finally, some key names to know are Robert McFarlane and Oliver North. McFarlane was a naval officer who worked as national security advisor for Ronald Reagan during the Iran Contra Affair. He conveniently resigned from his position right before the affair came to light. Oliver North, a National Security Council staff member, was also a key player in the Iran Contra Affair. He helped with a lot of the planning and coordinated the whole operation after McFarlane left. So, how did all the pieces come together? What was the one solution that both fixed the hostage crisis and supported the Contras, all without being caught? Well, that was the Iran Contra Affair. With the pressure put on the Reagan administration to get the hostages back, the US made a deal with Iran. The US would send weapons and get the hostages released in return. Keep in mind that Reagan not only stated that he wouldn't negotiate with terrorists, but he also vowed to ban weapons sales to Iran. By going through this deal, he would be breaking both of these two promises. Even still, Robert McFarlane, the national security officer who was told by Reagan himself to fix the hostage crisis at all costs, made a very convincing argument. Not only would the deal release the hostages, but it would also help improve the US relations with Middle Eastern countries. This divided the administration, as many stood by their opinion that no weapons should be sent to Iran, but with approval from President Reagan himself, the plan progressed into action. In order to keep it under wraps, they sent a lot of missiles through Israel. It was in their best interest to fuel the ongoing war between Iran and Iraq to divert attention from them, so the country of Israel became a great ally in the diversion of weapons. So, how does this relate to the Contras? Due to the Boland Amendment, the executive branch could not legally send the Contras money or aid in any form. Did this stop them? No. There is one key thing I did not mention in the deal. In addition to the hostages being released, Iran would also send the US money. Money that would be completely off the books and easy to reroute. Easy to say, reroute directly to the Contras and aid them in their efforts in Nicaragua. This entire idea came from an unlikely source, Manuker Ghorbanifar, an Iranian double agent who helped facilitate the missile deliveries from Israel to Iran. In a meeting with Oliver North, Ghorbanifar offered to bribe North to continue to ship the missiles through Israel. North refused, and Ghorbanifar instead offered to send this money to the Contras. North said that he would think about it. When he got back, North gave this idea to McFarlane. They then used the idea, cut Ghorbanifar and Israel out of the deal, and shipped the arms by other means. This brings us onto the topic of diplomacy. Although these actions may not seem very diplomatic, this is a perfect real-world example of something called backdoor diplomacy. At its basics, backdoor diplomacy is just diplomacy outside the public view, but it can go deeper than that. One difficulty of a hidden operation like this is that everything is ruined when just one party slips up and releases information. This is normally combated by the fact that, in a backdoor diplomatic deal, both parties have something to lose. In the case of the Iran Contra Affair, the Reagan administration would be in trouble for selling weapons and funneling money. Iran would stop receiving those weapons, and the Contras would not receive any more financial aid. By keeping the whole operation under wraps, all of these issues could be avoided. Well, for 2 years, that is. In November of '86, a Lebanese newspaper called Al-Shira published a very curious article. They claimed that there was a secret operation selling arms in exchange for hostages between the US and Iran. As it had not yet been proven, or even tied to the Contras, Reagan promptly went on national television and shut down any accusations, but the investigation was already underway. North tried to shred as many documents as possible, but things still began to unravel. Initially, the cover-up tactic was to prove that there was no arms for hostages exchange. Reagan made a bunch of press statements, but they eventually backed him into a corner when the National Security Officer, Poindexter, admitted that there was, in fact, a deal. In response, Reagan commissioned the Attorney General to conduct a full investigation. This internal investigation eventually led to the discovery of the diversion memo. Although North had shredded all of the information he could find relating to the Iran-Contra affair, he missed a few papers, including one called the diversion memo, a document that clearly outlined the inner workings of the scandal. This was the first time that the pieces had been publicly and legitimately connected. Finally, Oliver North stepped forward and admitted his involvement in the scandal. He began to release information and claimed that both McFarlane and Reagan had known about it. Reagan proceeded to shut down the accusations, saying that he knew vaguely what was going on, but not nearly to the extent that people were saying, and certainly did not promote it in any way. This did not sit well with US citizens, however, as the people's trust in the government was very low since Watergate just 12 years prior. McFarlane tried to get out of the mess entirely, as he attempted suicide and failed shortly before being called to testify. In the end, Oliver North and Robert McFarlane, as well as many other government officials, were found guilty. Due to his cooperation, North got off fairly easily, and all others were eventually pardoned by President George Bush. Surprisingly, the court bought Reagan's argument, and he got off with no charges. When his term came to an end, despite the scandal, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any US president. The Iran-Contra affair was a huge national and international event. It was, as Reagan had written, the next Watergate, but was it all bad? The Contras got over $100 million from the US, and about $32 million from Saudi Arabia. The 3 hostages were released from Lebanon, which was considered a big national success. Although it goes down in history as one of the largest presidential scandals, it is proof that policy and diplomacy are not black and white. Setting aside the moral and legal debates on the matter, the Iran-Contra affair was a great example of backdoor diplomacy being very effective, and the deal proved to be beneficial to all parties in the long run.
Thank you. God bless you.